I would like to introduce my co-moderator and my co-host on CS Radio, Amy Lynn Kirshner.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
And we have a very distinguished and exciting panel with us this morning. So I would like to give everyone the opportunity to introduce themselves. And I will just go around in the circle here. I can start with Judd, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm Judd Kessler. I'm an associate professor of business economics and public policy at the Wharton School, as you might tell from my background. And I've been working with Penn Career Services for a few years on some technology to help employers find students, and we're expanding it now to other schools. And we do it in a way that to try to understand racial and gender bias and then to try to correct it.
Thank you. Christine?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Christine Cruz-Vergara. I'm the Chief Education Strategy Officer at Handshake. We're the largest early career network. Many of you at Penn know, as you use Handshake as well for your students. It's a pleasure to see Judd again. I had a chance to actually talk with him and some of his colleagues around his research, which is really interesting and fascinating. And prior to my time at Handshake, I was actually in career services like many of you, having worked at 4 different institutions, private and public, large and small, up and down the East Coast. So excited to be here with all of you today.
Nicole?
Hi, everybody. I'm Nicole Torricelli Harris, and I'm the Director of Talent Acquisition for the University of Pennsylvania in the Division of Human Resources. And I actually started my career in career services at Boston University Law School. So I'm really just happy to be here and really happy to talk about this topic. I've been at Penn for about almost 8 years and seen a huge shift in how technology is working to impact bias in the hiring process.
Thank you. And last but not least, David.
Thanks, Michael. My name is David Kojic. I'm the founder and CEO of UConnect. We started UConnect in 2014 to improve access and engagement with career services. Short background is that I used career services throughout my time in college and benefited tremendously from that. A few years after college, realized that not all students were taking advantage of these incredible resources. And so we started UConnect to improve access for all students to career services, help them reach their potential. So thanks for inviting me. Excited about the conversation.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our guests. And if you don't know already, Penn Career Services uses both Handshake and UConnect. They're fantastic platforms. And not only is their technology great, but we really believe in both of the organizations and their missions, and they align really closely with our mission and values in Penn Career Services. So very excited to have this conversation today. And I'm going to see if Milan can kick us off.
Absolutely. So we'll start off with a big question. How can technology play a role in changing systems or helping to increase access and or equity? So a big one, but eager to hear all your feedback. Anyone want to get started with that one?
I could start.
Oh, go ahead, Nicole. No, you first. You first.
Okay. So of course I've been thinking about this. I think technology could potentially level the playing field in at least the first part of the hiring or screening process. So we've seen some, blinding of resumes. So eliminating school, eliminating name, eliminating address to really just hone in on the competencies. So candidates are all being evaluated from the same vantage point, which I think is one of the biggest impacts.
I love that.
But I'll give others a chance.
So I'll give you 2 concrete examples that I think about it from, and I'll give you Handshake examples since I'm at Handshake. So one is an experience that we've all kind of gone through 6 years ago. So when Handshake first came onto the market, it ultimately shifted a systemic practice that we were all really used to, which was having closed enterprise software system for our individual institutions, right? So you had whatever legacy system for your school, and employers had to come find you, they had to create an account, and then they had to do that for all the 50 or 100 schools that they wanted to recruit at, and they had to repeat that behavior over and over again. And what that does is it constrains behavior because employers only have so much time. So when they only have so much time, they choose to only go to certain places, right? And how people make those decisions is ultimately biased because you might be making it based on reputation, based on the name of the school, based on where your partners or your CEO or C-suite went to school, so on and so forth. So when Handshake first literally introduced Handshake and they introduced it as a network, that is an example of systemic change, right? They introduced it as a network and said, actually, we could share employers. By sharing employers, we can actually increase access for everybody. And when we talk about equity, equity is not a zero-sum game. You're probably going to hear me say that multiple times in this hour that we're talking together, but it's not a zero-sum game. So actually, we can all benefit. But for those of us that were in career services 6 years ago and remember this, it was really scary at the time. There were a lot of people that were highly skeptical of this. I don't know about sharing. I don't know about having this on a network. That seems wrong. That seems like I'm going to hurt my students. When in reality, when that happened, every single school that's joined the network has actually seen a 200 to 300% increase in the number of opportunities and jobs that their students have been able to take advantage of. So we were able to sort of raise the bar, if you will, for everybody across the board. So that's one example of what we've done, and also what I think is a good reminder that systemic change often feels scary at first because it changes a behavior that we're really used to. But once we see beyond that, we often can then embrace it as a new norm because it can better help us achieve the outcome that we're looking for. I would say a second systemic change that is actually upcoming that I'm very excited about, that I want to see us continue to think about, is in career services and college recruiting, we do a lot of job approvals. It's a really antiquated practice that we participate in, and we participate in it if we think about the core values and reasons, because we want to ensure that our students are safe. We want to ensure that our students see relevant opportunities, right? Like there's some value to the core principles that we're trying to get at, but there are different ways, especially now that we have technology, that can allow us to get safety and get relevancy and personalization for our students that doesn't require us to close off, right? Access to different opportunities, but instead could actually be both. Students have access and they have personalization and a high level of trust, and technology can help to facilitate some of those. So I think those are very concrete examples of things that we certainly do in career services on a daily basis.
I would agree with all those things that that Christine just said, and I think almost sort of bringing it to an even more basic level. I think one of the ways that we think about how technology can improve access is just really about thinking about students today and their circumstances. The sort of traditional student is not so traditional anymore. Some students are on campus all the time. Some students are 18 to 24. Some students are adults with 3 kids at home. And so there's all these different circumstances that students are facing, trying to juggle their academic requirements, career planning, and everything else that's going on in their lives. And so I think, at the most basic level, technology provides access on students' own time, right? When they're available, when they're thinking about it. It could be Tuesday morning, could be Saturday morning, it could be in the middle of the summer, it could be over winter break. And so the ability to provide that information, provide that experience without requiring the student to go to the Career Center, knock on the door, schedule an appointment. I mean, that's incredible if they can, and if they can take advantage of that opportunity, but it's so important for a student to have a really high impact experience on their own terms, on their own time. And I think in a lot of ways, just that levels the playing field to, to make sure that everybody has the access to the same information and opportunities. And so the more we can invest in technology to give students and just, job seekers in general, a better experience on their own time, I think that, plays a big role in the bigger picture.
I guess I didn't go yet. So I come at this from a very kind of research focused mindset as an academic. So we built technology. We built a new tool that we are using at Penn, and as I mentioned, some other schools, to try to evaluate the preferences of employers who are doing on-campus recruiting at those schools. So, so when we did this, the kind of value proposition and we did it with research in mind, and I'm sure later on in the hour I can talk about what we found and how we're thinking about using it next. But one of the things we liked about the method that we developed is that we had employers evaluate resumes that were hypothetical, and the incentive to evaluate what is essentially fake resumes was that we were going to develop a picture of the employer's preferences, so how much they value different characteristics on a resume, and then we also collected real resumes from Penn students looking for jobs, and we were able to take the preferences of employers and look into the real resumes to see which candidates actually had the characteristics that the employers were valuing in the hypothetical resumes. And what that allowed us to do was to send to employers, this was their incentive for participating, the real candidates that best match their preferences. And one of the things we liked about this, and I think this is kind of an example of technology helping to expand access, is that we sent them folks that they might not have come across in the normal on-campus recruiting interactions. At Penn, as I'm sure at many places where they, my former students come and they hang out and coffee chats and try to get people that they know from when they were students to sort of come to the coffee chats and get exposure. That social interaction or that social network that pulls a set of folks into the funnel at these firms might miss students that would be a good fit that we're not friends with the people who got the job at that firm last year. And so we saw this sort of advantage of being able to kind of identify for firms candidates that they might not have come across in their normal recruiting practices. And I think a lot of the things that the other folks on the panel have said about the way technology helps is kind of expanding in various ways these sort of points of contact between firms and students. So I think that is I add to that as a kind of benefit, a systemic change that we've seen from technology.
Can I just add to my answer on, I want to put it in context. I'm coming at this from a large employer standpoint, and my team is really looking at, how do we improve access? How do we improve equity? And I wanted to just talk about a couple of things that we have in place, technology that is, as I mentioned in my first answer, kind of leveling the playing field. So the idea of providing access, having an applicant tracking system, an ATS, that's accessible, opens up the door for persons with disabilities. Having a process, a systematized process to evaluate candidates is leveling the playing field, like others have mentioned. So really, having evaluative factors that resumes are measured against, and whether a human gets in there at some point we're still kind of playing around with some new technologies. We use a video interviewing tool that all of the candidates who meet the basic qualifications are asked the same questions. So taking the human component out of the first level screening, in my eyes, from an employer standpoint, has really made a huge impact in kind of getting the people who normally wouldn't make it to the second round to the second round. So video interviewing, and we also use a couple other tools that I can mention later.
That really dovetails nicely into some thoughts I'm having from the career services perspective, both what Nicole said and Judd said, about things that we teach and encourage our students to do when they come into career services. So I was thinking, Judd said, a lot of recruiting in the past has been a closed network, right? I went to Penn, I'm coming back to Penn. There's 3 years of students behind me who I have contacts with that I can leverage that. We talk about all the time, leveraging the Penn network to make contacts at places where you want to work. As things like anonymous resumes come into play, how does that affect that career strategy? And the same thing with having to do video interviews. This is something that we've been dealing with for several years. Having students learn how to give an interview to a camera is different than giving an interview if I was sitting down with you in person, Nicole, right? There's no feedback. There's a different level of self-consciousness because maybe you can see yourself. So what are your thoughts on these sort of changes that are happening? And is there a double-edged sword to it?
And I might put just a finer point on that too, that, blinding is one thing, but what other strategies, and this doesn't need to just be to Nicole, of course, but how are we ensuring that more diverse candidates are funneled into the system in the first place, rather than just eliminating the potential bias, but from a pool of candidates that's already fairly static or similar?
I mean, I can touch on our process at Penn. We have an affirmative action statement. We're a government funded organization that has an obligation to abide by, pretty stringent laws around compliance. So our applicant tracking system tracks the diversity of the pool. Now, it doesn't track disability status, veteran status. So I'm using the term diversity very broadly. And while we have an obligation to sort of look at it and to have a certain amount of our candidate pool be from a diverse background, we have a very decentralized hiring practice. So our ATS is accessed by hiring managers who maybe hire every 5 years, who might be a PI on a grant and have, no training. We've systematized some things, but not everything. And just back to the question around, video interviewing. I mean, I think for this generation, it's sort of like a TikTok, you just don't get the likes. So it's one-sided, but it's a digital resume, or I'm not thinking of the right term, but it's a video resume essentially. So you're not getting that feedback, which can be good. For our employees, we do a workshop to actually coach them through how do you respond or behave in a one-sided video interview. How do you get answers out there that really communicate what you want the person on the other end to hear? So I think I answered both questions, but I'm not totally sure. And just to go back to the second question on getting diverse candidates to the table in the first place, we do an awful lot of outreach to community organizations. Career Link, which serves the underserved population in Philadelphia. There's a Chamber of Commerce initiative that we participate in. So part of our overall strategy is diversity outreach.
I'll jump in. I think when you're looking at I'll tackle your last question first, which is how do you get more diverse candidates even into the funnel or into the pool in the first place? And I think this is a good reminder that we're all part of an ecosystem. So no one individual or entity is going to be able to make all of that change by themselves, right? We have to do it collectively. So as career services, I think one piece is certainly working with employers around understanding, first and foremost, how are they even writing their job descriptions? So we did a little bit of research last semester, where we looked at sort of job descriptions and how it impacted men versus women applicants. and whether or not they were more likely or unlikely to apply for something, depending on some of the words that were used. So we actually have a blog post on this. I'll try and find it and add it to the chat so folks can take a look at that. But putting things like competitive, demanding, those words were less appealing to some of our women students, versus if you added things like high expectations, collaborate, right, coordinate, things like that, where it felt a little bit more collective. It might still be a demanding environment, but the way in which you're going to do it is collaborative, right? Sent a slightly different message to students. And so I think one is literally looking at the language. Language matters, and the words you use in your job description matters. The other piece too is recognizing that as employers, you have an opportunity to also share more information about the makeup of your organization. So students, we just did a Generation Z and gender diversity report just a few weeks ago. And one of the things we know is that this particular generation, 65% of them are looking for diversity before they decide if they want to apply to a company. So if your company has been working on this, if you are open to sharing that information, that might also attract more people. We know that women students are twice as likely to look for women in leadership if they want to decide if they want to apply or not, right? So things like that. And pay equity is an incredibly important piece for students in this generation. They're asking questions about pay audits. They're asking how regularly that's done. They want to see employers that are committed to those types of behaviors. So I think it's really important, as both we certainly do it in terms of our employer education at Handshake, but we also think it's important that we work with career services to get that message across to employers that these are some of the practices that can actually increase sort of your pipeline. When you look at Black students and Latinx students, there are also a few practices up funnel that actually change that. So one is the use of GPA. GPA has never been a great indicator of performance, right? Like we've actually known that for a really long time, but yet GPA continues to be a criteria that many of our employers use. Now, similar to what I explained in my first answer, it's not easy for employers to just switch off a particular behavior, just as it's not easy for us in higher education to just switch off a particular behavior. There's a process and it's an evolution. But one of the things that we've begun highlighting for employers is look at how many underrepresented students you cut off when you have an arbitrary 3.2 GPA sort of threshold. But when you open that up to 3, or you open that up to a 2.8, look how many more you actually increase. And it's not because those students aren't smart or intelligent. It's because GPA is a function of socioeconomic status and sort of the society and the already systemic issues that our country was sort of already born into and that we created, right? And so those things compound over time and impact our students in different ways. And so GPA is not a good example. The last thing that I'll say is making sure that you think about recruiting windows. So when you have a really short recruiting window, which is typically the sort of like 6-week period in the fall, that actually constrains the number of underrepresented students that actually apply during that particular time. And so when employers are able to either lengthen their recruiting window or do just in time or rolling hiring, whatever term you want to use, that actually, again, increases the number of underrepresented students that can come in to the pipeline. And again, the reason is not because they can't hack it. The reason is they might have other pressures and other obligations, like a part-time job, like family that they're trying to support, other pieces to their life that don't look like the traditional 18 to 22-year-old that is just going to class and doing extracurriculars. So if you want a more diverse candidate pool, you have to change some of the practices that you're looking for in order to get that.
I'd also just quickly add, thinking about candidates who aren't even in the funnel, right? Candidates who aren't, or students who aren't in the game, who don't have the confidence that they can pursue a particular pathway, or they don't have the information about what pathways might be available to them, or they don't have information about what pathways they might be successful in. And so, I think a big part of this conversation for me or for us is, thinking about, how can we empower people who, who are not sort of actively engaged in the career planning process, right? And engaging with career services is obviously a really important step for that. And sort of every engagement point we feel probably is going to contribute to confidence, vision, understanding, and encourage more people to pursue pathways that they may not have otherwise. And so simple things like taking an assessment or sitting down with a career coach or connecting with a mentor, seeing company profiles and learning about the mission and the culture and the values of companies that you recognize but have never thought about working for. All those little sort of micro experiences can be super valuable in terms of helping students build confidence and understand what a pathway might look like. And I think for a lot of students and people in general, that lack of information or that lack of confidence doesn't even get them to the table. And so, thinking about that side as well.
I have a few things I want to react to. The what David just said brought out the behavioral economist in me, which is it's hard when you're, if you're a student and you don't know that you need that there's this opportunity to access these resources. Like, you don't know that you have to be the one to take the first step to even like learn more about it. And it made me think when I was a college student, one of my professors forced everybody to come to office hours. So like we all had to show up as part of the class to show up to office hours a few times. And that was the first time that I ever like saw a professor as somebody who was just like a person who actually you could interact with. And I have no doubt that I'm a professor because that professor made us come to office hours and I got to see that side of it. And it led me down a path. In those meetings, he gave me advice about what classes to take and my thesis and so on. I would not have known that that was an option if it wasn't forced on me. So to David's point, it's not just making the resources available, but at the school level, making sure that the students, have at least one meeting where they talk to somebody that's required, and then they can sort of, do their own reflection of like whether they want to proceed with that. I also wanted to respond to some things Christine said, which taps into academic research that I've done and others have done about both getting people into the funnel and then the employer's sort of perceptions and employer's role in making sure the right people come through. So there's also, like Christine mentioned, academic research outside of Handshake that finds the same thing about the way that you word job descriptions. And the results I saw is that if the more explicit the job descriptions are, the clearer about what the responsibilities are, just that attracts women at higher rates. That like women want to know what the job actually entails, and the vaguer it is, like men don't seem to care, but women really are going to be put off by job descriptions that are vague. One of the things that's related to the work that we've done that was mentioned is just thinking about employer preferences and how employers that are well-intentioned about overcoming sort of these systemic issues still have bias that is implicit, that's kind of built into their the way that they're thinking about resumes. So when we did our study, we recruited employers that did on-campus recruiting at Penn to participate, to evaluate 40 fake resumes, to get, as I mentioned, the sort of real Penn candidates as that fit their preferences. And so we had them evaluate the resumes, and we randomized everything about the resume. So we randomized the name to get at race and gender. We randomized GPA, we randomized the job experiences. We also went through a blinding procedure, which makes me, I get a little worried when the things that are blinded are just name, address, and some other things, because we had to randomly put in like a extracurricular activity on a resume that might have a male or female name. There was a lot we had to do, like obviously fraternities and sororities. If you're on, we made a lot of women's varsity teams into Penn varsity teams, and like there's a lot of hidden kind of subtle information throughout the resume that signals race and gender, and so you have to be careful about that. But what was surprising to us, I think that sort of disappointing, is that we saw bias. We saw various forms of bias. It was bigger in folks recruiting for STEM fields. It was bias against women and minority candidates. It was both in the overall ratings of how much they liked the candidate. It was also in how likely, we had a question asking them, how likely would the person be to join your firm if you gave them an offer? And there was bias on that measure, that firms thought women and minorities were less likely to come to their firm if given an offer. But at the end of the survey, we asked the employers that were rating the resumes sort of how their firm valued racial diversity and gender diversity in hiring. And 90% said that they valued it, that they were kind of wanted it and were considered it positively in their hiring. And yet they were displaying this bias that was subconscious, because we saw that it got worse as they got more fatigued and evaluated the resumes more quickly. It got got bigger then. And so I think there's a kind of it's nice for the firms to kind of recognize that they have this problem, but I think they too soon assume that they've addressed it in kind of having the right explicit views about what to do, and that these sort of biases can continue to persist even with well-intentioned recruiters.
That's such a good point, Jen. I just kind of want to acknowledge the assumption of a gender binary here as well. And to thank Sharon for dropping the Handshake study in the chat so you can find it there. I also wanted to just call out that Handshake has recently added pronoun options into the platform, which I think is so helpful for a variety of reasons, of course, but I'm curious if anyone has other thoughts on that, or how to, I think this is the next step too, then it's like we can take these steps in the entry process, but how do we have these conversations with employers about making sure that the workplaces stay inclusive and you don't just have a representative candidate who then becomes an employee who faces additional and undue challenges because they're this potential token in the workplace as well. So that's a big topic as well.
I'll comment on that. I mean, I think as a career services, advocate for really eliminating bias as best you can, to evaluate, does the company even have a statement about diversity? Do they have an affirmative action statement? Would be the first step. And then what is their hiring practice? How are they evaluating resumes? And I'd look for those who are putting some tools in place. I was thinking, as Judd was talking, our facilities and real estate services group, we were under audit and cited by the Department of Labor, OFCCP, which is a big, scary government agency that could potentially pull funding. And we had to take every applicant for every job, and Penn gets hundreds of applicants for most positions, and put them into a spreadsheet without their name and check the box for every single characteristic and interview anybody who was, a four or higher. So it was years of experience, regardless of what industry. So I'd say you want to really hold employers who come on our campus, who post on Handshake, accountable, and to have them deliver some summary of their hiring practices and see what that's about before we put Penn students in front of them.
I think helping our students to understand what questions to ask, I think that was perhaps something that someone put in the chat earlier too, but our students also have a responsibility as they think about what kind of organizations they choose to go work for. And as a whole new generation comes in and starts to make choices that match their values, that sort of show what's important to them, that also forces the hand of employers, especially those that have yet, like Judd said, to actually change anything, right? And so how do we help our students to think about the types of questions that they should be asking to better inform their decisions? So there's the typical ones. Tell me about your sort of racial, ethnic, gender breakdown at your organization. Tell me who's on your leadership team. Tell me what your board of directors or your board looks like, right? Like those are all really concrete things. Some of it you might even be able to find online. I then personally, as a woman of color who has learned this sort of along the way in my own journey, there's a few questions that I really like asking in interviews that give me more insight into the type of environment that I'm going to be in and how to potentially navigate, or at least know what I might be walking into and if I want to navigate those things or not. So one question I ask a lot of people throughout my interview panels is, tell me what's one unwritten rule in this organization. What's one unwritten rule in this organization? And that often is super interesting to sort of see how people talk about it. You see if there's consistency, or you see if different people really notice different things depending on perhaps level, or depending on what function or division or team that they're sort of in, right? It at least gives you, there's kind of no right or wrong answer, but it just gives you insight into how the organization might actually work. I also like to ask a question around, tell me how decisions are made. Like, what does that process look like? Who are the individuals that sort of touch that decision? Who ultimately makes the call, right? And then I ask them more questions about like, oh, okay, well, I kept hearing this person's name a lot. Tell me more about who that person is and what their role is and what are they like and what's their style like? So it gives me a sense of, is this sort of a consensus decision-making place? Is this a very top-down decision-making? Is this a consultant decide? Is this data-driven in the way that they make decisions? Does it seem like some of the early team members, perhaps if you're going to a startup, seem to have all the influence, right? And so you kind of, again, just know what it is you're getting into as a student. And I think those are the types of things that I always encourage students to think about, because quite frankly, most of us don't get coached on that. You kind of figure that out as you take your first, second, third job, and you start to realize, wow, okay, these are the questions that really matter because it impacts my well-being and my stress level on a daily basis. So I think those are the types of things I would encourage us to also be teaching our students.
I think I want to double down on that and say, again, because my mindset is the subtle ways that bias enter in the recruiting process, that like those questions absolutely should be asked. And I would say that it behooves the career services or Handshake or whomever is like doing the initial screen of the job candidates. And I know we were talking about job approvals in like a kind of a way where, it's kind of treacherous ground, but like those are questions where having the organization that is the sort of lead in to the student eventually, being interviewed, asking those questions, maybe posting, the answers written out, does two things. One, it emphasizes to the organization that this is something that's not just one student, who might be concerned about this, that in fact it's like organization wide. And two, it takes the pressure off of students, because some of those questions, like particularly as you get into an organization, that I loved them. I want to ask, I'm tenured, so I hopefully won't be interviewing for a while, but like those are the kinds of questions I would want to know the answers to at any place I work. And at a very specific group level, it might have to be the candidate interviewing. But the tough questions like about racial and gender diversity and like, sort of the questions that are pushing the organization to do better, right? I worry that advising a student to ask those questions, they might get backlash, intentional or unintentional, of like, oh, this person's going to be difficult. And so I don't, I want the organizations to do that because they don't have to worry that they're going to be held, sort of punished unintentionally or intentionally for asking the tough questions. And the students then can kind of know the answers, but not, and not feel like they're the ones that have to like do the work to change the organization.
We are touching on a lot of different things, and something that I think has come up in the last two answers is how we're preparing students. And so I want to ask, where does everyone see the role of career services in all this? And I both from preparing our students, but also working with employers. Like Christine touched on something that I know is a huge pain point for my colleagues, which is really short recruiting windows that seem to be growing shorter and shorter in certain industries,
and earlier
and earlier and outside the career services ecosystem, which can be a good thing and can be a bad thing, right? So if they're going to say, we're going to start recruiting sophomores for two summers from now, which as someone who's outside of that world, I don't even understand how that's a good practice, but it seems to be for them. So how do we work with our students to help them confront these changes, and how do we work with our employers?
I just want to say one thing quickly that's a little bit more towards the last question, which is I think we're at an advantage in higher education with being able to have something like first destination outcome data. And I think it's, probably safe to say that we're underutilizing that data or underinvesting in that data. But that data, I think, can do a couple things at a really high level. Firstly, if we can match it with, and Christine might have specific examples that would be helpful, but if you can match outcomes of students historical outcomes of students in the past and have the ability to indicate those students' gender, background, circumstances, affinities, you can really inform students in a very specific way about what students who have come before them have gone on to do, and most importantly, students that they identify with, at least at a high level, right? And then also, it could put employers' feet to the fire a little bit more. You can highlight which employers are actually recruiting which students, and the more data you have, the more, the more sort of telling that is. And then you can steer students in particular directions, and students can access that data themselves and make more informed decisions about what pathways to go down, and when they're going down that pathway, what employers are actually sort of practicing what they preach. So I think there's a big opportunity to invest in that data, and the ability to, collect it year in and year out is, I think, an advantage in higher ed that we should take it, that we should take more seriously.
And I would say, there's something to be said for celebrating the employers who are doing a good job at this and holding them accountable in kind of a public way. Penn has really moved to having a big chunk of our procurement or purchasing from minority vendors, and there's a mandate for that. And so Division of Human Resources gets to see how much of our spend was with minority owned businesses, minority or women owned businesses, and almost go about it the same way. You have to be a little bit coy because you don't want to turn off the large employers that might not be ready for that. But if the institution is really making a commitment, Penn as an institution, to eliminating bias and social justice, then I think we have to say that, we're doing business with people whose values are aligned with ours.
So I'll zoom out a little bit. I know Barbara on the line has certainly heard me talk about this before, and some others might have read my most recent article with Farouk around 5 future directions in career services. I think this really goes to needing to integrate career education into the fabric of an institution. I've been saying this since essentially like 2010, but it's been too long now that career services sits as a peripheral office or entity or service on the side. And if students happen to come in, they get some great service like David, they walk away feeling helped and feeling like they know what they want to do. And unfortunately, if you look, we partner with over 1,200 universities and colleges. And when you look at the average of how many students are actually touching career services, on average, it's only about 35%. 35%. That's a lot of students that are not touching career services. And in large part, it's because it's not required, right? So like Judd talked about this as well. He was required to go in to the office hour, right? It changes things. So one of our responsibilities, certainly, and I know we use our platform at Handshake, I have the privilege now of sometimes sitting at the table with university presidents, with different administrators, with different third-party associations that have more influence around some of those pieces. And it's one of my core messages is this is a really critical piece to the student experience. And technology, while it can partner and it can complement, it will not replace the human element. And so when it comes to career services, it's really important that we think about creative ways that we can integrate it into the fabric of your institution. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One, University of Miami recently has decided to integrate career services 4 different ways. One is to ensure and require that all students are actually touching career services at orientation. They all have to make and activate their Handshake account and start their profile. It's then an assignment in their first year course that the students go through to actually complete that profile. And Miami's thinking was, look, the reality is we don't have a big enough team. We're never going to be able to touch all of our students. So at the very minimum, we need to get them in front of the technology that we've purchased so that for the students who don't really need a lot of our help, they'll at least have the help of the technology to be able to move them forward. They can get access to the programs and the events and some of the marketing that we do, and they'll at least have that piece. Then they can better target because now everybody's activated their account. So they're actually able to communicate with the students, especially the ones that really need them, around some of those other pieces. And they're using our DEI template and reporting to actually determine semester after semester are there gaps to particular groups that are not utilizing that actually might need more intervention, and they're then tailoring that intervention more specifically around some of those pieces. They also have an app. They have a University of Miami institution app that they're now also embedding Handshake into, so that when students are on the app, they can sort of see that component as well. And then I'll give you another example from a different institution, George Mason University, where I used to work. My successor, Saskia Campbell, fantastic. DEI is a huge area of focus for her. And she's actually written their entire 3-year strategic plan to focus career services as a social justice effort and initiative. So if you want to check that out, go to their website. You can see their strategic plan. It's absolutely terrific. And she has some different initiatives and very concrete steps around what they are trying to achieve in the next 3 years to actually move this forward for their students and with their employers as well. And I think those are the types of examples where you want to see people really embed and integrate and try and figure out, the reality is higher ed doesn't move quickly, right? So instead of looking at it as a challenge or an obstacle, think about how you can actually use those pieces as an asset. How do you use the tradition, the structure, right? And the fact that some things really don't change very frequently, how do you use that to your benefit? How do you find a way to insert yourself into those particular experiences? And it might be at other systemic levels. I'll give you one last example from my time at Wellesley, in case this is helpful too. It doesn't just have to be a student experience. So at Wellesley, I knew that faculty were going to be an incredibly important part of whether or not we would get buy-in around career education and whether or not we would be able to really shift the culture and get students in. So one of the things that I did was, when I started my position there, I negotiated a title that allowed me voting rights in academic council. Okay, so by doing that, I knew that I would be able to sit at the table at academic council and I would be able to bring legislation to council, but you had to be a voting member to bring legislation to council. I wanted to do that because I knew that in my second year, I was going to bring legislation to create a career education council, if you will, that had faculty on my committee. Any of us can create a committee or a task force in higher education. I didn't have to be on academic council to do that. But the reason I did that was because I knew that there was a carrot for faculty that are part of formal committees. That committee service hour, that helps them with tenure and promotion. I wanted a carrot for the faculty members that were going to be involved. They would be more invested and they would be able to then help to be my champions and sort of shepherd that out to the rest of the community. And that made a huge difference. We went from having less than 10% of our students utilizing our services to I think it was 87 or 90% of students within about 1.5 to 2 years, right? And it was almost 99% by the time I left. And so thinking about other ways that you can find to insert yourself can be really, really helpful as we continue to move forward. So those are just a few ideas to get your brain kind of jogging and running for Penn.
In my opinion, there's no doubt that is that has to be the path, is like Christine said, integrating it into the fabric of the institution. I think at UConnect, we believe very strongly in this sort of idea of career everywhere, which is really the career center. Michael, to your question, the career center's role, moving from being the provider to being a facilitator of meaningful career conversations everywhere a student is. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One is the ratios are daunting as it is, right? Even if you have a big career center staff, there's no way that you're going to be able to provide the level of attention and support that all your students need. Forget, like, obviously the the specialized interests that students have. It's really hard to have all those backgrounds and expertise on your staff. I think secondarily is a lot of students don't necessarily want to go into the career center to seek out advice, but they are engaging with people that they know and that they trust every single day, whether it's mentors, peers, parents, academic advisors, faculty members. And so the ability to sort of mobilize those stakeholders, or students who are already engaging with every day, to be able to talk about career is so important to the ability to scale, so important to the ability to serve all students, and ultimately I think is the role that the Career Center needs to play going forward, is facilitating these conversations rather than being the provider.
Judd, I saw a question in the chat. It was one that was already floating in my head. I would love to hear your perspective on, since our audience here today is all from Penn, we currently don't have career courses or a deeply integrated into the academic life here at Penn. And there are challenges to that here. You know, we're not one institution, we're 11, and yet we're one. So I think it's something that we think about constantly in career services. And from a faculty perspective and someone who's very invested in career readiness and outcomes, I'd love to hear your perspective on that, Judd.
It's a great question. And you know, I think I'm of two minds. One is, you know, the faculty may in fact be an under-tapped resource for providing career guidance to students. I think the way Christine organized it by, you know, getting faculty to have some kind of skin in the game is great in terms of, you know, serving on the committees, but, you know, also just sort of this being part of our responsibilities, but also sort of being recognized for it the same way that, you know, other committee or responsibilities, you know, are kept track of, and the associate dean looks at them when deciding, you know, about our promotion or so on. You know, I think there's the tension. So I do, you know, I advise my students. I write letters for students. Not as many as you might think. So, you know, I teach a class with, you know, say 60 to 90, depending on the year, undergrads. And really the only ones who ask me for career advice are the ones that end up doing, you know, research for me as a research assistant. And so sort of are more in my orbit than just being kind of a student in my class. Now, you know, I personally, and I think this probably is true for the vast majority of faculty, only have great insight into the career path that goes like through a PhD into academia. I had experience doing on-campus recruiting when I was an undergrad, thinking I might become a consultant instead of an academic, but I'm sort of limited in that mindset. Now at Wharton, some of my colleagues were consultants or did other things that our students would typically go into before deciding to do academia. They have great insights into that, you know, as well as potentially contacts from their old days that they could be helpful with. But I think, you know, thinking about Penn, thinking about the, you know, 11 schools that you mentioned, thinking about the diversity of faculty at those different schools, I would be shocked if you couldn't assemble a group of people who ended up as professors, but had the kind of variety of experiences that our students might be interested in pursuing, and, you know, and sort of could use them in a more sort of planned out way to kind of provide the guidance to subsets of students that have profiles that might go in that direction. But I mean, to answer the broad question, you know, I some of our students do take advantage of the faculty. That, you know, I do not require, but I do encourage my students to come to office hours and talk about their career plans. And anytime a student comes, I say, you know, no, this is sort of a weird question, but like, do you know what you're doing after you graduate? Like, you have, so I try to kind of go in that direction, but, you know, we are not used to the extent that we might be. And so, you know, I think that that's an opportunity at Penn in particular, and I would suspect that at other schools as well.
Can I just add one other thought that's slightly tangential to what Judd was just saying? In thinking about the role of career services, I also think it's important to constantly reevaluate what our value proposition is. So for those of you that know Adam Grant, of course, he's just written a book called Think Again. If you haven't read it, I'm in the middle of it at the moment. And one of the things I really love about what he talks about in the book is this notion that, especially in the type of world that is ever evolving and so quickly these days, we have to be willing to actually think again about our beliefs and what we think is right or the right way to approach something. And that's not actually an affront to sort of who we are or what our values are, but rather that's a really healthy way of developing as a person. And so he talks about sort of how attachment actually tends to, it clouds our judgment And it keeps us from being able to see that perhaps our opinions need to change about certain things. And the way to actually unlock joy in being wrong is detachment. And there's two different types of detachment. One is detaching your present self from your former self, but being able to tell a cohesive story of how you got from one to the other. And the second is around detachment of your opinion from your identity. And I want to focus on that one for a moment because I actually think that's really critical in our field. So I think often we identify ourselves as, well, I'm in career services, I'm the job poster, or I'm the person who approves jobs, or I'm the one who does all the career fairs, I'm the events person, right? Like you've tied your identity to this thing that you do, rather than to the value of why you do the thing, right? So Adam talks about it's important to actually clarify your value. As a teacher, hopefully your value is that you want to help students learn, right? But how you help them learn is going to ebb and flow and change over the course of time, right? So the sort of practices that Judd uses now might include a lot more virtual. It might include a lot of online learning. It might include different types of modules that he was never using before, right? But now he's learning that, hey, that's a new way to teach a student. So as career services, I would hope that our value, our ultimate value, is just simply helping students find meaningful work. The way in which we do that maybe is not going to be appointments, or isn't going to be career fairs, or isn't going to be X, Y, and Z, right? I'm not actually saying that. It could be all those things too, right? But I'm using that as an example. But we have to think about what is our value proposition. So that was a long way of saying one of the things that cannot replace your knowledge and your expertise is that you ideally should really know your students, right? You know your students better than any employer could know your students. So when you think about your value proposition to employers and how things are shifting and changing, they have access to virtual, they have access to a lot of things that they can host. And I would guarantee Barbara probably had multiple people on her team that at one point was like, you know what, I would love to do that, but I don't have time to do that. I'm so busy. I have so many events. I'm doing so many things. Well, guess what? Some of those employers are doing those things now. You don't have to do some of those things. So now you have time to do some of the things that you had wanted to do before. It's just a matter of like re-shifting our thinking a little bit. The other piece about knowing your students is that you know student groups, you know, ideally, perhaps the classes and the courses and the skills that your students are learning. So how do you further deepen your knowledge in some of the things that actually can't really be scaled or replicated or turned into technology? Because that becomes a huge value add that you provide to employers as well as to students in helping to make some of those connections. And I would also say, Michael, you talked a little bit earlier about employers sometimes wanting earlier and earlier access to students, right? I would actually say that's not always a bad thing. There are some of our underrepresented students who actually should get earlier access to employers because, to Judd's point earlier, they didn't even know that opportunity existed. They didn't even know that could be there. So they already have to kind of catch up. So if you really know your students and you know where some of those pockets are, actually you could help facilitate some of those earlier connections, because democratizing information is the first step to actually democratizing access. And I know David definitely agrees with that. It's a big piece of how, you know, UConnect actually works. So I would just add that as another piece, is think about how you can really be a great channel marketer for employers, and how you can really embed yourself perhaps more with student groups or with understanding courses and the skills that our students are gaining, so that you can help make some of those connections too.
You know, I really latch on to a lot of what you say, Christine. I think it sort of brings us full circle back to our first question about technology. I have a very technology-centered role in career services, and I think it's very easy for people to look at technology change and go, oh, you know, when I started in career services, which was a long time ago, but not that long ago, just for the record, there was still a binder of paper job postings. We had an electronic service, right? But there was somebody's job to print out the emails and open the mail of people that sent paper job postings and put them in a binder that we kept in our library. And occasionally someone might look at it, right? Because we had other services, right? So it's easy to look at that and laugh and go, I can't believe we did that for so long, paper, you know. But I think it's important for us to look at other things like that as well. Just because we've done programming a certain way or advised in a certain way, to me, there's a parallel between printing things on paper and doing things like that too. And I think just because technology is so prevalent in our lives, it's easy to laugh at that paper binder, but not see that maybe something we do every day is that paper binder.
I really agree with that. We have 3 teenagers and 2 of them are college age. And I started in career services when there wasn't even email. So I got you there. But they're looking for something different and something that they can access quickly. So how do we package the message? How do we package the tools in a way that's going to resonate? And how do we do it 5 different ways? Because we have become a society that has choices in everything. And so we have to respond to this generation and the way the world's working. And it's like, you get to choose. You're in the office, you're on Zoom, you use an app or you're face to face. And so the more we can take what we know, as experts and put it into an easy access app or message or, all different tools. So.
I might just add that, I think that the pandemic in some ways has caused a lot of organizations to sort of rethink their purpose, rethink their value. There's a really big opportunity to do that in higher education outside the Career Center, right? And I think for a lot of schools, a big sort of common thread will be supporting their community and mobilizing their community more broadly, helping people around them. Like, Penn is such a force in Philadelphia, right? Helping people in Philadelphia achieve more economic and social mobility. And that sort of causes me to think about the opportunity to extend career services even beyond students, right? Extend career services to people in the communities around institutions. And if we can really figure out how to deliver a highly effective, accessible user experience online, then you could probably do that without a whole lot more resources, right? And so I think a little bit about that and the opportunity to do that. I mean, higher ed did that in some ways with the MOOCs, before there's all these, issues with MOOCs that are probably widely understood on this call. But there was this element of, hey, we're going to open up our curriculum. We're going to open up our content to people, whether they're enrolled in this institution or not. And I think there's an opportunity to do that much better, but I think there's also an opportunity to extend resources that you guys provide to students and alums, maybe, to people more broadly, people in the community that could benefit tremendously from access to some of those resources. So it sort of aligns with the conversation around rethinking your purpose, but that's an opportunity that we've been thinking about.
Go ahead, Nicole.
David, I was looking for the link, but the Chamber of Commerce has just organized a group of a large consulting firm, Accenture and Graduate Philadelphia. There are 5 big partners, and it's called Philadelphia Skills Forward Initiative. And they've done a ton of content online. They're going to open it up. They're partnering with organizations like Penn to have a mini training program and then make available opportunities for those who participate in the training program. It's a wonderful initiative, healthcare, technology focused for the moment, but my sense is that they're expanding. So great point.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. At the highest level, right? If we have every student meaningfully engaged in career services that's in higher ed, you're still overlooking, 99% of the population, and arguably a lot of the population that needs it, more so than even our students. And so it looks like from the description that that's an initiative that hopefully is happening more often to provide more access to career information, skill building services. It's incredible and should be happening in every city and community one day.
I love that, David. I think that's such a good point. Yep, I think there's a couple of links in the chat now to that. Any last questions for our panelists? We have just a few minutes left today. I know I've been furiously scrambling to jot down notes myself, so I'm really looking forward to kind of ruminating on some of these things. And just as Barb said, thinking about our innovation pillar and seeing how we can implement some of that change going forward. Any last questions? Lots of thanks coming in, of course. Thank you all for your insights for sure. Great. All right, well, thanks everyone so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks to everybody for tuning in. This was great. Thank you, fellow panelists.
Thank you for having us. Great to be here with you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yes, thank you to all of our panelists, not just for doing this today, but for being just fantastic partners to career services and to the students of University of Pennsylvania, and for Handshake and UConnect for students everywhere. It's deeply appreciated, and I can certainly agree again, just bringing us full circle. When I first saw both of the platforms, I went, oh, things just changed. And in a good way. And it sometimes took a while to get everybody to share my enthusiasm, but we really, really do. So thank you so much.